Hello and welcome to GuyLogic. My name is Temco, and today we're taking a look at a game called the Techomancer. Developed by Spiders and published by Focus Home Interactive, it is a sci-fi action RPG set on Mars, where you play as a Techomancer, a sort of magical, electrifying, wielding, badass fighter in a world that sort of the future, but it's also sort of post-apocalyptic, and it's a really cool, interesting narrative and story overall. So before we dive into the action combat of the game, we're going to take a look at the options menu and talk a little bit about PC performance and all stuff like that, and then we'll head on straight into the game. If you are not interested in this sort of thing, I suggest you press the annotation on screen and skip straight ahead to the gameplay section. The gameplay options has a view of gameplay controls. You can rebind all of these and the game runs with mouse and keyboard as well as gamepad quite well. Though I do have to say that the mouse and keyboard controls are a little bit fiddly, especially for movement and the way momentum works in the game, which is definitely attributed to the way an analog stick on a gamepad would respond to those kinds of key presses. So that's a bit of a letdown for the mouse and keyboard side, but they are fully rebindable with alt keys as well, so that is really good. The game control options allow for some camera sensitivity, some x-axis changes, and some vibrations if you are using the gamepad, which is disabled obviously because I'm using a mouse and keyboard. You can change this in the menu. It does not auto-detect when you're playing the game, so you do have to manually change this, but you can change it during gameplay if you should so desire. Gameplay wise, there's a couple of difficulty settings as well as full tutorials, and tutorials in the game mostly are tooltips and pop-ups that showcase how something works and doesn't work. And there is a intro sequence that explains everything in the first 5 or so minutes of the game. So overall, the game does do a pretty good job of introducing you to its mechanics, most because the amount of mechanics in the game is not that big. It's a pretty self-contained title. Subtitles on raw for the various cutscenes, damage numbers whether or not you want them and however you want them based on your full RP experience, and then the various positioning elements for your UI. Audio-wise, you have the master volume and 3 slider volumes. I would have liked to have a separate slider volume for background noise as well as effects volume. There is some weird stuff going on here with some of the levels based on certain situations. I'm not too happy with the way the game designates certain sound options, but the master volume overall does let you compensate for that quite a bit. Going into the video options, there's quite a few, but not that many as I would have liked to see. Full screen or full screen windowed as well as windowed mode are all available. The game properly constrains mouse to window for a change, and everything you might want under design is enabled, including VSync. The game isn't locked to 60, so you can run it higher as you so desire. No problems whatsoever, and it does support quite a few resolutions under the sun. There is SSAA, shadows, SSAO as well, the type of anti-aliasing you want, the amount of particles all the way up to high, texture quality goes all the way up to ultra, and anisotrophy goes all the way up to 16. And then you have some field of vision and dynamic resolution. The game is over the shoulder third person, so you don't really need a field of view slider, but I'm still very happy they've included that. The game is also very monochrome bluish colored, like you see this menu in all its design and art aspects in terms of UI and menu and things like that. I'm not too happy with that. It's the generic look, we're the future sci-fi and everything is see-through blue. I don't really like that, but such is the case. It does work quite well and everything is readable, so no complaints on that aspect. Graphically, the game looks okay, but not stunning. Now, I can't run the game on full ultra settings on my GTX 780, as you might expect with the card 2 generations old. But even on 1080 tests, the game still dipped below 60 in certain situations, running everything on high, indicating some less than stellar optimization. Not bad in any stretch of the imagination. The game runs quite well, but it doesn't look as pretty as it could on what you'd expect of current day hardware, so keep that in mind. Going on, you can change the brightness settings if you want. I put mine a little bit higher than the recommended settings, mostly because I felt certain parts of the game were really dark for no particular reason, losing a lot of key detail in background and texture and stuff like that. I think they did this sort of thing to sort of compensate for the fact that certain textures just look a little bit outdated even now and look a bit jagged or old and outdated. So I think they upped this brightness a little bit lower on defaults, so you don't see that if you go with the default settings and you don't notice. But if you up them a little bit, you can clearly see some textures that don't look as if they were made for today, more like they were made for a game in 2013 or maybe 14. Not the worst thing in the world, but not the greatest either. And then we'll have credits, and such is that. The game has a guide, which is nothing more than 10 pages you can run through, that explains certain things in the game, like attributes and talent creation, and the way certain things work, like hotkeys and the like. It's pretty decent, but it isn't a replacement for a proper in-game tutorial, which the game also has. So it's a nice little extra to have there. Other than that, you have continue new game, or you can load a game if you so desire. The game always runs you the same protagonist, which is a bit of a shame, but not too bad. You can change his face around and stuff, but he's always a male, he's always the same name, and he always has like the same voice and art style and all that stuff like that. So that's a bit of a shame. I also am a bit disappointed in the way the story is told. It is a very linear story, even though it tries to be multi-pronged. It sort of takes the approach of The Witcher 2, in where it says this is the story A to Z, this is what you're going to experience, and you can make some diverging choices in the middle of the road. A bit like Mass Effect 3 does it, a bit like how Dragon Age Origin does it. Lots of choices, but they really boil down to 2 or 3 distinct endings. This game has a few choices and they all kind of converge around certain points of the story, so you'll see chapter 1 is all sort of going to diverge, and chapter 2 is going to be a bit of a convergence in certain main character arcs, and then you have these little sub-arcs going left and right. So overall, the story is pretty decent, but it does have some drawbacks in terms of the way it's delivered, as well as the way it progresses and its multi-pronged nature, of what it tries to be a diverse story instead of a linear experience. So there are some letdowns here and there, but overall a pretty decent story. Now we're gonna go ahead and dive into the gameplay. I'll show you a little bit of the gameplay. This is about, I think, 70-80% into the game. Right around level 30 when your character is. I finished the game at level 38, I think. So this is about right there at the end. And to showcase the gameplay, UI elements and stuff like that. So let's go ahead and dive into our save file and go from there. So, gameplay. Now before we go any further, I'd like to note there are some spoilers in this segment. You'll hear names, you'll see map icons and the like that may contain story spoilers. I've tried only doing side quests in this gameplay footage, but keep in mind there are some dialogues and stuff like that that will be spoilers. So as such, let's move forward. The most important mode about the story to make is that outside of the pretty linear, if somewhat obfuscated nature of the story, it is pretty good. There are quite a few tie-ins to past history, to a very rich lore that is explored only a little bit, so there's lots of parts of the world and lots of parts of the history of this world you are not being treated to, which may indicate that these developers have done their homework and there's a big book of things somewhere in an office that showcases the world and how it came from the first settlers from Earth going to Mars, and how the society as you see today, with the humans, with the mutants, with the Techomancers, with all that sort of thing, has come to be with these. There's a lot of story here that is not told directly, and that is pretty cool. The story that is told directly is pretty interesting, if a little bit linear and straightforward. So there's no real complaints about the story here, but there are some complaints about the gameplay and the way it tries to force you into certain paths. Now the game already says so at the start that specializing in a specific tree is not the best way forward, and it's right. I went with full Techomancer and had a lot of trouble in the early levels of the game. If I had to specialize into warrior on top of Techomancer, and the warrior is the one doing the two-handed staff wielding stuff, and the companions you get during the game are pretty subpar for the most part. Their AI is the main issue here, and that's also the main issue with gameplay, going from the way you spec as a character, as well as going the way you go forward with various enemies and AI types, as well as combat and dialogue. So to elaborate on this part a little bit, the dialogue system is pretty straightforward. You've seen these systems from Dragon Age Origins to Bioshock all the way up to Fallout 3. You get a dialogue, it's a sort of pseudo in-game cutscene. You get a few options you can pick from. Sometimes you get a little bit more information that unlocks new story elements. Sometimes it unlocks new interesting sights to see or places to explore, or maybe some loot. Sometimes it gives you a little bit of information about the background of the world. Overall, pretty straightforward. Sometimes you have options that progress the story or a very specific quest within the story. Again, pretty straightforward. Quests are highlighted on your map MMO style, and characters you speak to are only going to speak to you about those few things, and they only have those few canned conversations moving forward. I don't mind that so much, but it does showcase that this game has a very limited scope, and it does try to pull out the most it can out of that scope, but it's still very limited, and you can see this in dialogue and you can see this all those things. The limited scope also clearly applies to AI, with your companions being so uselessly dumb as to be pretty much a hindrance more than a help in many situations. I can't remember the amount of times I've had one of my companions be in guard mode, where they are a guardian with a shield and a sort of mace club-like thing, and their goal is to prevent damage or to survive and to sustain themselves. and they'll just look the other way while they're getting hit in the back and not even react to it. I can't even count the number of times one of my AI companion that has a job of healing me ignored healing and instead went for melee combat, or other things like that. I also can't even fathom the amount of times I've come across an enemy AI that ignored me or ignored a companion that was really low on health to chase something completely different. There's a lot of these things that do bring down the quality of combat simply because the AI is so weak. That doesn't mean that the gameplay in terms of combat is bad. No, far from it. The combat system in this game is phenomenal, and it is really helped by this sort of pseudo Arkham style reactive combat. You have your basic move, you have your special move, you have your dodge move, and based on the stance you're inheriting, so the two-handed wielding warrior, or the gun and knife wielding rogue, or the shield and sword sort of like guardian, a lot of this stuff bases on that. So you have a shield bash if you have a shield, you'll have a stab ability if you are a rogue, you'll have a jump and stab forward with a staff or a very long range attack in melee if you are the warrior. There's a lot of variety here, and switching between the three stances and using the various attacks and dodges is very smooth and very good in terms of both gameplay, in terms of combat, but also in the way it feels. If you notice your enemy is going to do a very heavy charge attack at you and you dodge at the very last second, the game is going to give you a sort of Matrix bullet time slow motion effect where you nearly dodge the enemy's attack, and vice versa. If you get a really good hit off an enemy that you just dodged, it'll again give you that bullet time to sort of emphasize how well you did in that particular moment. And these aren't overused, they always stay sort of fresh, and while they're not unique in any way or shape or form, they're just the same moves you've been doing the entire time, they do add a little bit of oomph to the combat that would boil down to you hitting an enemy in the back repeatedly until it falls over. So overall, the combat here is really good from a mechanical standpoint. Also, on top of that, you have the Techomancer abilities, and here a little bit of my issues come from the fact that some of the enemies are immune to that. Now, you might say, well, then use something else, but the problem here is that most of the gameplay is structured around you being a Techomancer. So you use these electric abilities of throwing lightning bolts at enemies and electrifying the ground and stuff like that. And while the amount of abilities here is limited, you can always use them on top of one of the three stances any given time. And the problem is that around halfway into the story is that the enemies start wearing electricity resistant armor all of a sudden. All of them. I'm not even talking about the grunts not having it, and then the higher end guys or the higher level guys that are not in bunches of scrap suddenly getting it. No, even the grunts, the guys that you fight repeatedly in random corridors across the world, suddenly have electric resisting armor, which means that these fights that are tedious and boring, for the most part because they're random encounters that aren't going to give you anything of value in terms of loot or in terms of experience, or not going to even add anything of value in terms of quest or story progression, are delaying your movement forward. So I don't really like that part, mostly because it reduces the quality of the idea of you being this sort of magical, spiritual cleric of electricity, and you shoot lightning bolts with your hands. And that is a bit of a shame. Now, moving away from the combat and story, we go into the way the world is built and how the game progresses you through it. You have several skill trees, one for the three class types as well one for your Techomancy tree, and you can put points into these every few levels. Now, it's not that every level you get a stat and every level you get a point. No, every few levels you get a ability point, which you can put in one of 6 ability trees. These are for lockpicking, so you can open locks. These are for crafting, so you can craft higher end items, and I'll get into crafting in a little bit. These can be for things like exploring, so you can skin indigenous animals that are on Mars. Again, the world has a very cool story and background in all these things, how they have terraformed Mars and all that stuff. And you have a couple of these abilities you can put points in. Each ability has 3 levels, you can put up to 3 points in each of them, and there are some items and some companion skills that give you a little bit of a boost to some of these skills at any given time. You also have your stats points, which tells that you have a certain amount of strength, or dexterity, or intelligence, so to say, and this is directly related to the amount of gear you can have, or the certain types of weapons you can use. A big staff requires higher strength than a weaker staff, and so on and so forth. And certain Techomancy skills require higher end gear for Techomancy, so you need to balance that up and forward based on the way you're building your character in true RPG fashion. Lastly, obviously you have your combat skills, and these are skills that are both passive and active. There's very few activatables, there's about 5 or 6. If you build yourself fully to the end of the game, you'll have, and if you don't, you can get like 8 or 12 maybe maximum in the game. And these activatables are things like a lightning bolt, or a bubbling area of lightning that explodes, a berserk ability that you use to gain more damage, or whirlwind attack with your staff, stuff like that. There's also a couple of passive ones that increase like your dodge chance by 10% or increase your damage output by 15% and stuff like that. So you have a bunch of these spread out through the skill tree for each of the 3 types of stances, as well as Techomancer, and you can put points in all of these and build your character as you deem fit. There's no way to respec that I have found in the game, and there are, and this is pretty important, a couple of crash to desktop bugs I've encountered using these menus for skills and stats, though I have spoken with the developers and they have said that these are going to be fixed on a day 1 patch. So I guess we'll see whether that holds true, but for now, keep in mind there are some crash to desktop bugs, so not the best of things here, technically speaking, in terms of using their skills and abilities. Those are also the only crash to desktop bugs I've encountered personally, but developers mentioned they fixed around 10 of them, so yeah, I'll leave that in your hands as to how much you put your faith into that sort of thing. So having spoken about the way animations work in combat, I'd like to talk a little bit about how traversing the world feels. Now, the world is split up in a variety of maps. Each map is split up in certain sectors. So there's inside, outside, certain levels, and you can mostly traverse the sectors as you deem fit. So you have a map and you go to a door and you open the door and you go to the next area, and whether this is a pub you're entering or a den or you're moving into a special area with an elevator, these things are generally just obfuscations of loading times. The main issue I have with this is that all the animations for getting up the stairs or jumping down a ledge or climbing up a ledge or going through a door are canned animations that always take the same amount of time and take away control from your character from you. So if you want to enter a room and leave a room, you have to go through a lengthy open the door, walk through the door, close the door animation, and then you get control of your character back. You have to first press the action button that is default on the E key, then you climb up the ledge, and then your companions will eventually find their way up the ledge some way or get teleported up there magically if they can't. And then you can move forward with your character and do some things like combat. Problem is that if you jump down a ledge and combat initiates while you still don't have control of your character, you can take quite a bit of damage before you regain that control, and that is quite frustrating. Also, it doesn't really mesh well with combat. You'll be sprinting, running really fast, using the shift key to sprint, and come up to a ledge, and then press the ledge button, and then suddenly your character will slow down, lose all his momentum, and then sort of jump down the ledge, take 2 steps forward really slowly and casually, look around before letting you go on ahead with your sprint as if nothing happened in the meantime. It's really immersion breaking at that point. I'm not sure why they chose to include this canned and sort of forced jump down, jump up, open door, close door mechanic instead of just leaving that up to you and just having you interact with a actual ability to jump, which the game doesn't have. So there are some odd choices here. One more thing to mention about the movement and all the canned animations for traversing the world is that if you're in combat or the game thinks you're in combat, you can't use any of the ladders, you can't use any of the ledges, you have to wait until the game thinks you're out of combat and stuff like that, which means that you can't really run away from a random encounter. And if you've traversed certain areas like 7 or 8 times already just to get from point A to point B to point C to hand in this quest or get a next part of your side quest, it gets really frustrating to fight the same 3 mobs time and time again that are so far below you in difficulty that it just becomes a matter of going on autopilot, hitting them a few times and moving forward. One thing I will give the game though is when you're not fighting these repetitive mobs for the 7th or 8th time, combat is generally really well made, even in the amount of enemy variety types. The grunts for human enemies all the way up to the enemies that are electricity resistant, from guys that are roguish, from big brutes that can do a massive charge and do a big slam on you, from the sort of lizard-like ostriches with tentacle appendages that can do a charge and smack with their tails, to the sort of rhinoceros on steroids that can spit poison and pull you in. There's quite a bit of variety both in enemies from the humanoid side of things as well as from the monstrous variety. I do really like that. And none of them feel as if they're forced into the world. They all really feel as if they're part of this ecosystem on Mars. And for an RPG, that might actually be more important than actually having the diversity. And as they've nailed both, that is quite an accomplishment. Now, speaking about accomplishments, is something a little bit that is not so much an accomplishment, which is the gear and crafting system. Now, I say crafting system, but it is mostly a upgrade system in a very linear fashion. Gear in this game works in two ways. One, you have gear that you equip, and this gear is very simple. You have a couple of slots for your head, for your chest, for your legs, for your feet, and for your arms, and you can equip gear in all these slots based on the gear you currently have in your inventory. You also have a stash where you can store some gear if you like to save it for later. Maybe you have something for one of your companions, you're not anywhere near that companion, stuff like that. You can store it in your storage and then get back to it later so you don't go over your maximum weight limit. The problem is you never use the stash. You'll either instantly use it on a character to upgrade it or sell it off to a vendor. And the second problem you run into is that upgrading things is tedious and boring. One, you need to get parts. These parts you get by killing enemies and looting chests and doing a bunch of stuff like that. And then some of these parts you can buy from NPC traders and stuff like that. Overall, you say, well, nothing wrong with that. True. Then you have to get these schematics that you can only get in certain sectors. That means that your upgrades are also story progression locked, because you can only get the tier 4 upgrades from a zone that is unlocked when you are at Act 4 of the story, which is something I do not like, but I do understand it from a gameplay progression and as well as scaling of difficulty, or a difficulty curve if you would. So I can understand that sort of. What I can't understand is why these upgrades are so very bland and boring. You have increased damage, increased disruption, which is sort of how much chance you have to disrupt an enemy from finishing his or her attack, and then you have the little bit of thing that sort of does defensive for you, and based on the item you're upgrading, which is a piece of gear or a piece of weapon or a piece of helmet, you can get a couple of these, and some items have 1 slot, some items have 2 slots, some items have no slots. That is really it. You just double click whatever upgrade seems reasonable, and generally you just go for damage for your weapon and defense for your armor, and then you get a little bit of health regen if you are interested in that sort of thing, because you mostly will get that from your companion abilities on top. So overall, the upgrade system is very bland, and getting all the various resources, and you have no control over them because they're random. There's no upgrade mechanic, so you can transform your electrical debris into electrical parts. None of that is in the game. You're going to have a big pile of electrical debris, and you can sell it to a vendor, but you might not have enough later for an upgrade. And right now you might not have enough of a certain other part, and you might have to look for one of the 20,000 vendors in the game that just might have that specific upgrade part for you for sale. So I don't really like the upgrade system as it currently is. It does do the job though. It allows you to use items you might like later and further down the line, and also allows you to unlock a little bit of an extra tire on the gear you have. You can just sort of upgrade the gear you currently have to be just as effective as higher end gear that might drop from certain opponents, making your gameplay experience a little bit easier. And this is the last point I'd like to make regarding this. The game, in my opinion, on normal or high difficulty is still a little bit on the easy side once you know what you're doing. See, the first 2 or 3 hours, you're trying to figure out how everything works and trying to figure out all these various mechanics. Especially getting used to the very cool combat does take a little bit of time. Once you're used to that though, the game combat becomes very, very simple. You wait on an enemy to try to do an animation, you dodge that, and then smack him in the head. And you can do so repeatedly on end. You can use hotkeys and an active pause on the tab to administer yourself health potions or injects. You can re-administer yourself some of that sort of mana stuff, which is the liquids you have, and you go on for that. And I've killed enemies far superior to me that I should never been able to kill solo, when my companions are dead because they are utterly useless, by just chucking a few health potions, jumping around, dodging everything, and then hitting them with lightning in the face for very low damage for about 5 or 6 minutes until they finally keel over and die, again because their AI is weak. So overall, the game has some very cool parts in the way it presents story, the way it presents world, and the way it progresses through all of that. And if you stick to that, you'll have a very nice 20-25 hour experience of the game with some replay value, because you can try different skill combinations, and there is some divergence in how you want to do your reputation scaling with certain factions, whether or not you want to do things with the enemy faction of the Vori, which is a criminal faction, or you want to focus on the sort of merchant faction and get their goodwill, or the rebels that are against the army you're part of. There's quite a bit here interlaced in between the story. The overall story doesn't really change that much, so once you've had that, you can change it around a little bit, but the end result is still the same, more or less. There's a couple of endings, but again, not major differences. So there is some replay value there as well, and you can enjoy quite a bit of time with the game. The drawbacks though here are definitely a little bit on the technical side, with some crashes to desktop, with some limited scope for the variety of upgrades and the variety of gear, as well as the variety of abilities you have available to you. And my biggest gripe obviously is the way it takes control away from you to sort of hide these loading screens. Overall, I do recommend this title. I'm not sure on the price point currently, as it is a full-fledged $60 release, but overall it did provide me with a very interesting world from an RPG perspective, and it did provide me a very nice little twist on the Arkham style combat of sort of countering things. Not as blatant, but I feel it's a nice little system with a variety of abilities and options allowing you to keep the combat fresh. So Techomancer, you can check it out on Steam. It comes out on June 28th, and thank you for watching. If you like this video, press that like button below. If you didn't like this video, well, there's a dislike button for exactly that. And if you want to see more content like this on the channel, just press that subscribe button down below and we will deliver. So until then, I wish you a good day, and until next time, right here on GuyLogic.